In 1989, a distressing incident occurred in the quiet suburb of East Point, Georgia, leaving the local community with many unanswered questions and speculations for years to come. 13-year-old Jeremiah Marshall went missing from his home, leaving behind only questions and profound uncertainty. His mother, Vanessa Marshall, instinctively felt from the beginning that her son's disappearance was not voluntary and that he had been subjected to an unfortunate event. However, her stepfather, Frank Davis, and law enforcement officials shared the conviction that the teenager had simply run away, tired of home life and seeking freedom. For 6 long, challenging years, this convenient but inaccurate version remained the only officially accepted truth, obscuring a more complex reality. Fate, however, had its own plans for revealing this carefully concealed mystery. 6 years after Jeremiah's disappearance, a stormy, inclement night brought not only heavy rain and thunderstorms, but also an unexpected and significant turn of events. A burst water pipe in the attached garage forced Vanessa Marshall, the missing boy's mother, to confront for the first time in years a structural alteration her husband, Frank Davis, had meticulously and discreetly created. This wall, appearing to be an ordinary structural element, actually concealed a deeply disturbing secret that Vanessa had unknowingly been living within her home for all those years. The moment of truth was inevitable, and it promised to be profoundly impactful. The house on Maple Drive seemed to be more than just a dwelling. It was a place where unspoken emotions and hidden conflicts had been building up. Inuese. The house on Maple Drive seemed to be a place where unspoken emotions and hidden conflicts were simmering beneath a calm exterior. On that humid, muggy Friday night in the fall of 1989, the atmosphere was particularly tense, as if foreshadowing an imminent eruption. The air inside was thick with unexpressed resentment and escalating tension, which had been building for 2 years since Frank Davis, a man of rigid principles and an authoritarian nature, married Vanessa Marshall. He moved into the home she had once shared with her late husband and their son, Jeremiah, and his arrival introduced an unfamiliar, oppressive energy into the family dynamic. This tension, invisible yet palpable, was a precursor to a significant event that would forever alter their lives. Jeremiah, or JJ as he was affectionately called by friends and family, was only 13. He was, at his core, a good, kind child, yet also a bundle of unrestrained teenage energy, a fountain of cheerfulness and a rebellious spirit. His world was vibrant and dynamic, defined by the characteristic scratch of a DJ's record, the sharp hiss of a spray leaving its marks on the canvases of his imagination, and the powerful, rebellious pulse of early hip-hop that served as the soundtrack to his youth. He was the embodiment of his time, a living reflection of a culture that was just beginning to conquer the world, and his passion for it was genuine and all-consuming. His bedroom was not just a room, but a collage of posters, a testament to his musical tastes and cultural influences. Run DMC, Public Enemy, Big Daddy Kane, each an icon of the burgeoning hip-hop scene. During the day, JJ often spent time in the garage, a large detached building located behind the house. It was his personal sanctuary, his creative workshop, and dance studio. On a worn piece of cardboard spread directly on the cold concrete floor, he would spend hours perfecting his breakdance moves, to the thunderous, pulsating beat emanating from his old but reliable boombox. The garage was a place of freedom, self-expression, and endless possibilities for him, where he could be himself, without limitations or judgment. For Frank Davis, however, these sounds and manifestations of youthful energy were not just noise, but a direct challenge to his established order. Frank was a man of strict, almost stifling order, an experienced carpenter in his 40s whose life was built on principles of precision and control. He believed in straight lines, in quiet, measured evenings, and in absolute, undeniable control over his surroundings and his life. His world was one of strict rules and predictability, where there was no place for chaos or spontaneity. He saw JJ's vibrant, dynamic culture not as a form of self-expression or an innocent hobby, but as a direct, defiant challenge to his authority, a chaotic intrusion into the quiet, orderly world he so diligently tried to build around himself and his new family. He married Vanessa, a loving woman, but one already weary of life, still deeply grieving the loss of her first husband. Frank promised her a stable home with two parents, a place where she and her son could find peace and security. However, his vision of stability was in fact a vision of autocratic rule, where his word was law and his desires were undeniable commands. He perceived JJ's vibrant, lively culture not as a natural manifestation of teenage individuality, but as a direct challenge to his authority, as a chaotic intrusion into the quiet, orderly world he so diligently tried to create. And beneath his mask of strict but supposedly fair fatherhood lay a quiet, smoldering bias, a deeply rooted resentment. JJ's presence constantly reminded Frank that the house and family had a history, a rich past that did not include him, which caused a deep, persistent irritation. The disagreement that became pivotal began, as was often the case in that home, over music. JJ had turned his boombox up to full volume in the garage, and the powerful bass of a new EPMD track vibrated through the floorboards of the main house, shaking it. Frank, who was trying to focus on reading his newspaper in his favorite armchair, could no longer tolerate it. His patience snapped, and he, without restraining his irritation, stormed out the back door, ready for a confrontation. The sound, which for JJ was an expression of his soul, for Frank was merely an unbearable intrusion into his carefully constructed peace. "Turn off that noise," Frank shouted over the booming music, his face contorted with anger, every feature expressing undisguised displeasure. JJ, caught off guard in the middle of his spin, instantly turned off the music, but his voice was full of teenage defiance as he retorted, "It's not noise. It's music." His words conveyed not only disagreement, but also a deep misunderstanding of why his passion provoked such a reaction. "It's music, it's noise, it's a mess," Frank spat, looking around the garage with distaste, as if trying to find confirmation for his words in the surrounding disarray. His gaze fell on the empty spray cans that JJ used for his vibrant, expressive art projects on large pieces of plywood. "And it's a mess. I told you to clean up here," he added, his voice full of accusation, as if the mere existence of these items was a personal insult. "This is my space," JJ said, gesturing widely around the garage, as if trying to physically define the boundaries of his territory. "My dad built this space for me." This was not what Frank needed to hear. The mention of Vanessa's late husband always ignited a particular, irrational anger in Frank, as if a ghost from the past threatened his carefully constructed present. These words, spoken with such innocent confidence, became the spark that ignited the already smoldering conflict. "This is my house now," Frank said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl that foreshadowed trouble. "And that means this is my garage, and you'll respect my rules." His words conveyed absolute, undeniable authority, leaving no room for objection or compromise. He was not just setting rules. He was asserting his complete dominance over every corner of that house and over every soul living in it. The confrontation, which began with an exchange of barbs, quickly escalated into something more serious. Vanessa, hearing the raised voices and feeling the rising tension, came out onto the porch, her face marked by habitual weariness, the imprint of countless past arguments and attempts at appeasement. "Frank, please," she said, her voice full of pleading, "he's just a boy." She tried to appeal to his reason, to remind him of the teenager's innocence and vulnerability, but her words seemed only to fuel his anger. "He's a disrespectful punk," Frank snarled, his eyes fixed on JJ, his gaze full of cold, calculated fury, "and he's about to learn a lesson." His words were not just a threat, but a promise of retribution. He abruptly grabbed the boombox, as if taking away not just an object from JJ, but a part of his identity, his freedom. "If you can't be responsible, you don't deserve it," he added, his voice full of contempt, devoid of any sympathy. "Hey, get your hands off my stuff," JJ shouted, rushing forward. Inuese. JJ rushed forward, attempting to retrieve his belongings. Frank, possessing significantly greater strength, pushed him away forcefully. JJ stumbled, but managed to regain his balance, his face a mix of shock and anger, deeply indignant at the unfairness. "You can't do that," he exclaimed, his voice trembling with indignation. "I can do whatever I want in my own house." Frank roared, his voice full of absolute, undeniable authority. He turned sharply to Vanessa, his gaze full of reproach. "Your son needs discipline. Real discipline. Not the way you spoil him every time he misbehaves." Then he pointed a thick finger at JJ, his gesture full of contempt and command. "You stay here. You clean this entire garage, top to bottom, and you sit here and think about what you've done. I don't want to see your face in my house tonight." With these words, he slammed the garage side door shut, leaving JJ in the dim light, alone and despairing. The single bare light bulb overhead cast long, distorted shadows on the garage walls, creating an ominous, oppressive atmosphere. Vanessa, seeing the expression on Frank's face, an expression of cold, triumphant anger that she already knew, felt a shiver of fear run down her spine. However, she was too exhausted, too drained by endless conflicts and attempts to maintain peace, to fight him. She retreated back into the house, hoping that JJ would cool down and the storm, as always, would pass on its own. But this time, the storm was different, more ominous, and portending something irreversible. The disagreement did not end. It merely entered a new, more serious phase that would forever change their lives. Frank, whose anger was not satisfied by simply banishing JJ, returned to the garage. His anger, like a predator, demanded complete satisfaction. The confrontation with JJ resumed, but this time, without Vanessa as a buffer, without her desperate attempts at appeasement, it quickly escalated. In a moment of extreme control, Frank, a man much larger and stronger than a 13-year-old teenager, overpowered him. He then moved the unconscious teenager to the back of the garage, towards a new, thick wall he had recently completed, which was now to become a boundary. Behind this wall was a small, dark, soundproof room that he had secretly been building for the past year, carefully concealing its true purpose. To Vanessa, he had explained that it would be a hidden storage space for his tools, but this was merely a cynical, calculated deception. In reality, it was a confined space created to conceal. He placed JJ inside, secured his ankle, and then sealed the hidden entrance. In his distorted understanding, his stepson was now properly disciplined. He was permanently removed from Frank's ideal, orderly world, a world where there was no place for disobedience or another's will. An hour passed, then two. Vanessa, assuming JJ was still sulking and processing the argument, left him alone, giving him time to cool down. But when she finally went to the garage to check on him before bed, her heart tightened with anxiety. He was not there. The boombox lay on the floor, its plastic casing cracked, as if it had sustained an impact. Several spray cans were overturned, their contents spilled across the floor, indicating a struggle. Невозможно перевести се. But JJ was nowhere to be seen, and his absence was deafening. She wasn't worried. Not at first. He had run off to a friend's house before after big arguments, always returning the next morning with guilty apologies, like a little stray who always finds his way home. Frank, when she told him about the disappearance, merely grunted, his voice full of cynical indifference. Good. Let him learn what the real world is like. He'll crawl back when he gets hungry. There wasn't a hint of concern in his words, just a cold, calculated expectation. But JJ didn't return the next morning. He didn't return that night either. A week later, after desperate calls to all his friends and relatives yielded no results, after a deep and terrifying silence descended upon their lives like a heavy blanket, Vanessa Marshall finally officially reported her 13-year-old son missing. The last argument seemed to have ended, but in reality, it had only marked the beginning of a long, silent ordeal that would haunt her for years. The police investigation into Jeremiah J.J. Marshall's disappearance began not with a sense of urgency or deep concern, but rather with a weary bureaucratic sigh, foreshadowing a routine, impersonal procedure. When Vanessa Marshall, with eyes red from tears and a face worn out by a week of sleepless dread and despair, sat in the sterile interrogation room of the local precinct, she was met with a practiced, calming composure that seemed more dismissive than reassuring. Their tone conveyed not sympathy, but a hidden judgment, as if she herself were to blame for what had happened. Her husband, Frank Davis, sat beside her, perfectly playing the role of the concerned, heartbroken stepfather. His demeanor was impeccable. Every intonation, every gesture was carefully rehearsed. It was he who spoke the most, his voice a mask of sorrowful submission, carefully concealing his true motives. He recounted the argument that Friday night, presenting it not as a confrontation caused by his own uncontrollable anger, but as the culmination of JJ's escalating rebellious behavior, as if the teenager himself had provoked his fate. He was a good kid deep down, Frank told the detectives, shaking his head sadly, as if mourning a lost soul. But he got in with a bad crowd. The music, the graffiti, he was angry at me, at the world. I tried to be a father to him, to give him the discipline he needed, but he wouldn't listen. For the two white detectives assigned to the case, men already inclined to view the problems of a mixed-race black family through the lens of cynical stereotypes and preconceived judgments, Frank's story was a convenient gift. It was a neat, simple narrative that required minimal effort to verify and perfectly confirmed their own biases about troubled teenagers from such families. A rebellious black teenager from a dysfunctional family, as they saw it, conflicted with a new stepfather and ran away. This version fit perfectly into their stereotypical thinking. "We see this often, Mrs. Davis," the lead detective told Vanessa, his tone full of condescension bordering on contempt. "A new man comes into the house. The boy feels his territory is threatened. It's a classic power struggle. He's not missing. He's making a statement. He'll come back when he runs out of money or when he gets tired of living on the streets." There was no shadow of doubt in their words, only certainty based on superficial observations and ingrained stereotypes. Vanessa's protests, her desperate assurances that JJ would never do such a thing, that he would never leave her, were dismissed as understandable but naive maternal denial. Her words, full of pain and intuitive knowledge, were ignored as if they held no weight. She tried to explain his deep love for home, for art, for the very garage from which he had disappeared. She spoke of his attachment to family, of his dreams and plans. But the detectives merely nodded, their expressions unchanged, remaining impenetrable and indifferent. Their minds were already closed, and no arguments could shake their preconceived notions. The final blow to the investigation came 2 days later when Frank Davis made his next, carefully calculated move. He called the precinct, his voice full of false emotion, carefully concealing his triumph. "I found it," he said, his voice trembling with feigned sorrow. "I found a note." He then presented the detectives with a crumpled piece of paper torn from a notebook. "I found it in his room, tucked into a book," he added, creating the illusion of a casual but significant discovery. This act was the culmination of his ominous plan, designed to definitively close the case and solidify the false narrative. The note, written in a careless handwriting mimicking a teenager's, was a malicious, calculated lie designed to convince everyone of JJ's voluntary departure. It spoke of feeling trapped, of hating his new life, of an irresistible desire to escape to the big city where he could be free from all restrictions. It ended with a defiant, almost audacious plea: "Don't look for me." Every word was carefully chosen to create the image of a rebellious teenager who chose his own fate, absolving any responsibility from those who should have protected him. When Vanessa saw the note, her heart broke into 1,000 pieces, but at the same time, a deep, intuitive doubt arose within her that she could not ignore. Deep down, she knew that this careless, angry handwriting did not belong to her son. JJ's handwriting was like his art, full of grace, characteristic loops and sharp angles, reflecting his creative nature. The note was crude, simple, devoid of any individuality, but her grief was a tangled fog, and these were people in authority, holding what they called irrefutable evidence. Her doubts were drowned out by their certainty, their authority, and the investigation ended almost before it began, leaving Vanessa alone with her unspoken anxiety. With the runaway note as a convenient and final conclusion, the police compiled a standard report that was disseminated with an insulting lack of urgency, as if it concerned a lost item rather than a missing child. There was no widespread search, no media frenzy that usually accompanies such cases. Jeremiah Marshall's case was closed, his disappearance archived not as a potential crime, but as the predictable act of a troubled teenager. Frank, the concerned stepfather, gave them a perfect story that fit their prejudices and required no additional effort, and they readily accepted it, turning a blind eye to all inconsistencies. The 6 years that followed her son's disappearance were an exploration of the slow, corrosive power of unresolved grief, which, like acid, ate away at her soul. For Vanessa Marshall, life became a quiet, gray landscape. The vibrant colors of her world had been washed away on that fateful autumn night in 1989, leaving behind only faded shades of sorrow. Every day was a struggle, every breath a reminder of an irreplaceable loss that gave her no peace. She lived with the man she thought she loved, her husband Frank, but their home was haunted by the ghost of her son and the deafening silence of his absence. On the surface, they maintained the appearance of a normal life, creating an illusion of well-being for the outside world. Frank was an exemplary husband, steadfast, hardworking, and, at least publicly, deeply sympathetic to his wife's enduring sorrow. He hugged her on anniversaries, JJ's birthday, the day he disappeared, and murmured comforting words about how one day their boy might return home, a grown man, full of regrets and apologies. He played his role with chilling perfection, his performance a masterpiece of deception, a carefully orchestrated act that concealed a disturbing truth. But beneath the surface of their quiet, measured life lay a subtle, psychological terror, an invisible yet pervasive threat. The garage, once a place of youthful energy, loud music, and creative disorder, became Frank's forbidden sanctuary, his personal fortress. It was always locked, its doors remaining inaccessible to Vanessa. Frank spent countless hours there, and the sounds of his work, sawing, sanding, the hammer's thump, were a constant rhythmic backdrop to their quiet evenings, like an ominous metronome counting time in their strange existence. He called it his workshop, his refuge, his personal space. Vanessa, however, knew this place only as a source of cold, unwelcoming energy that seemed to emanate from it, permeating every corner of the house. In the first year or two after JJ's disappearance, she tried to enter the garage, driven by a desperate hope of finding some small, forgotten souvenir of her son, a casual drawing, an old cassette, something that could remind her of his presence. But Frank's reaction was swift and severe, his voice dangerously calm as he said, "This is my space, Vanessa. My tools are precisely organized. I won't allow you in there, disturbing the order." His anger was so disproportionate, so cold and frightening, that she retreated, shaken by his sudden, inexplicable fury. Over time, she learned not to ask, not to approach the garage. It became a silent, locked testament to his authority, a room in her own home that she was not allowed to enter. It was a physical manifestation of his control, a constant reminder of his dominance that permeated every aspect of their lives. The garage became a symbol of the unspoken mystery that hung over them like a sword of Damocles. Her affection for Frank struggled with a tiny, frightened intuition she couldn't name, but which constantly whispered something ominous to her. It was a cognitive dissonance that slowly but surely eroded her peace of mind. She loved the man who brought her coffee in the mornings, the man who fixed the leaky faucet, the man who hugged her when she cried for her lost son. But she also feared him. She saw the coldness that could flare in his eyes when challenged, the obsessive need for control evident in how he organized his tools, his life, their lives. It was a contradiction that slowly drove her to distraction. And sometimes deep at night, when the whole house was silent, she lay awake, listening to the sounds of the old house, the creak of the floorboards, the rustle of the wind outside the window. And she wondered about the narrative the police had so readily accepted. JJ, the runaway, the boy involved with substances or groups. It never felt right, never aligned with her intuitive knowledge of her son. She would go into his untouched room, look at the Run DMC and Public Enemy posters, and remember the police detective's smirk when he saw them. Is that what he was into? He had asked, as if the music itself was proof of wrongdoing, as if a teenager's interest could justify his disappearance. She remembered the note Frank found. Deep down, she knew that this careless, angry handwriting did not belong to her son. JJ's handwriting was like his art, full of grace, loops, and sharp angles, reflecting his unique individuality. The note was crude, simple, devoid of any soul. But her grief was a tangled fog, and Frank and the police were so confident in their version that her doubts seemed to her like mere manifestations of madness. Over time, she began to doubt her own memory, her own judgment. Perhaps she didn't know her son as well as she thought. This self-doubt was Frank's greatest weapon, a prison for her mind, just as the garage wall was a prison for her son's body. He masterfully used her vulnerability to reinforce his deception, making her believe that she herself was to blame for her sorrow. Frank, meanwhile, nourished her doubts like a poisonous nectar. He subtly reinforced the police's version, constantly returning to it in conversations. He was a good kid, but he had a temper. Vanessa, he would say, his voice full of false sympathy. You know, he got in with those kids from the city. I was just trying to protect him. He positioned himself as a stoic, misunderstood paternal figure who tried and failed to save a misguided boy. He allowed her to grieve, but presented it as grief for a son who made poor choices, not for a son who became a victim. He was a master of manipulation, and Vanessa, blinded by grief and trust, could not see the truth. And so Vanessa lived in a state of quiet dread, a prisoner of a mystery she could not unravel, as if trapped in an invisible cage. The specter of her son was a constant presence, his absence a physical ache in her heart, giving her no peace day or night. But in her home, there was another, more insidious presence, the presence of an unspeakable deception. The secret, locked behind the garage wall, was a secret kept by the man who slept beside her every night, the man she trusted with her life. She was living in a place of concealment and didn't even know it, her days a slow, agonizing 6-year journey toward a discovery that would be more unsettling than any nightmare she could imagine. The storm that hit their suburb in late summer 1995 was truly powerful in its intensity and scale. For 2 days, rain poured in continuous, wind-driven torrents, turning streets into rushing rivers and overwhelming the city's old drainage systems, which could not cope with such a volume of water. On the second night of the storm, Frank Davis was out of town, a rare and unusual occurrence. He was on a weekend carpentry job for an old client 2 counties away, a trip he could not postpone, and this confluence of circumstances proved significant. Vanessa was alone in the house, surrounded by the roar of the elements and a premonition of impending trouble. The sound of thunder shaking the window panes seemed like a harbinger of something dramatic, and flashes of lightning illuminating her small living room with sharp, ghostly flashes created an ominous atmosphere. It was just past midnight when she heard a sound, a loud, unsettling groan of strained metal, followed by a sudden, rushing roar. It came from the direction of the garage, and its nature was unmistakable. Something serious had happened. Her heart pounded in her chest like a trapped bird as she looked out the back window. The floodlight above the garage door illuminated a stream of water pouring from underneath it, forming a swirling current. A pipe had burst. Her first thought was Frank's tools, his precious, meticulously organized workshop, which could now be damaged. He would be furious, she thought, anticipating his anger. Her second thought was pure, practical horror. Water was now flowing towards the house's foundation, threatening its integrity. She needed to act, and immediately. Donning a raincoat and old boots, she grabbed a heavy flashlight and pushed through the torrential rain to the garage's side door. It was locked, as always, as if guarding some grim secret. She fumbled for the spare key Frank kept hidden under a loose stone, a key she hadn't touched in years, as if it were a forbidden artifact. The lock was stiff but finally yielded, turning with an unpleasant screech. She pushed the door open, and the scene inside was chaotic destruction. Water was inches deep across the concrete floor, swirling with sawdust and grime, creating a murky, repulsive vortex. Boxes had toppled, their contents spilling into the muddy water, and a roar emanated from a burst pipe along the back wall, spraying a high-pressure stream everywhere. She found the shut-off valve and, with great difficulty, managed to turn it, silencing the roar. The only sound now was the dripping water and her own ragged breathing, muffled in the silence. Her flashlight beam cut through the damp, stale air, sweeping across the scene of disarray, picking out debris and clutter from the darkness. And as the beam swept across the back wall, the new, thick wall Frank had built 6 years ago, supposedly for soundproofing, she saw something that made her freeze, as if struck by lightning. The drywall on the lower half of the wall, saturated with floodwater, was soft, bulging, and in one spot, it had begun to crumble, revealing something behind it. Water was seeping not only onto the floor, but also from behind the wall itself, as if it were weeping, giving away its secret. Driven by a sudden, terrifying suspicion she could no longer suppress, a suspicion that had been a low, quiet hum in her mind for 6 long years, she approached the wall. She reached out a trembling hand and touched the soft, crumbling drywall. It yielded easily, disintegrating in her fingers like sand. And then the odor reached her. It wasn't the smell of damp plaster or rotting wood. It was the smell of deep, profound decay, a smell so horrifyingly, unmistakably organic that her stomach churned and bile rose in her throat, portending something unbearable. Her flashlight beam trembled violently in her hand as she pulled away more of the soaked drywall, revealing a dark, hollow void within. It wasn't insulation, as she had thought. It was a space. A dark, narrow, secret space, hidden from view. She directed the light inside, and it fell upon a pair of wide, frightened eyes staring back at her from the darkness, filled with unspeakable terror. A scream tore from Vanessa's throat, a sound of pure, primal horror, the sound of 6 years of suppressed fear and intuition erupting all at once, as if a dam holding back a flood of pain had burst. She stumbled backward, falling into the muddy water on the garage floor, her mind refusing to believe what she had seen. Curled in the far corner of the dark, confined space sat a figure, a young man, pale and emaciated, his hair long and matted. And a rusted chain led from his ankle to a bolt driven deep into the concrete floor. He was a specter, a creature of darkness, but he had her son's eyes. Her son, her JJ, he hadn't run away. He hadn't left her. He was here, right here, in this garage, a captive for 6 long, agonizing years. And the man who had comforted her, the man who had shared her bed, the man who had helped her grieve for their lost boy, was his captor. The individual responsible was not a stranger from outside. It was her husband, the man she loved and trusted, and this realization was the most devastating blow. In that moment of horrifying discovery, her mind shattered into 1,000 pieces like fragile glass. She scrambled to her feet, her terror momentarily eclipsed by a fierce maternal instinct that demanded immediate action. She ran out of the garage, fumbled for the keys, locked the door, as if trying to lock the nightmare inside, and then ran. Her legs carried her through the storm, through the pouring rain and the rumble of thunder, to a neighbor's house. Her cries for help finally broke the long, terrible silence of Maple Drive, announcing the end of a nightmare and the beginning of a new, equally agonizing chapter. The hours that followed Vanessa's horrifying discovery were blurred by flashes of police lights, disembodied voices of strangers, and a cold, numb shock that enveloped her like a shroud. Her 911 call, a choked, hysterical report that she had found her long-missing son alive and confined inside a wall of her own garage, brought the full, overwhelming force of the law to her quiet suburban street in East Point, Georgia. The house, her home, was no longer hers. It had become a significant incident scene, cordoned off with yellow tape, swarming with uniformed officers, detectives, and forensic experts, each part of a mechanism designed to uncover a disturbing truth. Detective Ronell Pierce arrived at the scene shortly before dawn. A perceptive, observant black man in his 40s, he had been a junior officer back in 1989 and vaguely remembered the case of the runaway J.J. Marshall. The official version had never felt right to him, but back then he lacked the authority to challenge it, and the case had been quickly closed. Now, as the lead detective on this new, horrifying discovery, he felt a grim sense of vindication and a deep, profound sorrow for the woman sitting, wrapped in a blanket, in the back seat of a patrol car, her face a mask of shattered disbelief, reflecting the full depth of her suffering. He spoke to Vanessa gently, his voice a calm anchor in her storm of trauma, trying to keep her afloat. She recounted the story of the burst pipe, her forced entry into the forbidden garage, the crumbling wall, and the nightmare she had uncovered. She told him about Frank, his obsessive control over the garage, the wall he had built for soundproofing, and the argument on the night of JJ's disappearance. Every word was steeped in pain and horror, unfolding a picture of monstrous deception before the detective. Meanwhile, the forensic team began their work with grim, methodical precision, as if dissecting a long-festering wound. The false wall was carefully dismantled, revealing the hidden chamber within. It was a confined space, small and crude, but chillingly effective in its purpose. There was no mattress, but a rough wooden pallet covered with old, dusty blankets, serving as a bed for the captive. In the corner was a small, crudely installed drain in the concrete floor, designed for waste. A single low-wattage industrial bulb in a wire cage hung from the ceiling, providing minimal illumination. At the base of the wall was a small, locked metal slot, clearly used for passing food and water, like in a prison cell. The walls were covered with thousands of desperate, overlapping marks, a heartbreaking calendar of over 2,000 lost days, each scratched by the captive's hand, counting time in his confinement. The rescued young man, now confirmed as Jeremiah Marshall, was rushed to the hospital. He was 19 years old, but his body was frail and emaciated, his eyes blinking in terror at the sight of a world he hadn't seen in 6 years. His psychological trauma was immense, unimaginable, leaving deep scars on his soul. He was a living testament to a disturbing event that shocked everyone. As the sun rose, casting a pale, sickly light on the scene, a search was launched for Frank Davis. He was no longer the grieving husband. His mask had been torn away. He was an individual whose actions were now revealed to the world. He was found 2 hours later in a modest motel 100 miles away, where he had stopped for a carpentry job. He offered no resistance, as if resigned to his fate. When officers told him why they were there, a strange, almost serene expression of submission appeared on his face, as if he'd been waiting for this moment. The calm, respectable facade he had maintained for 6 years collapsed, revealing the cold, empty truth of his true nature. Frank Davis's questioning was brief, but unsettling. Faced with the undeniable evidence of his living victim, he confessed. He sat in the small, sterile interrogation room, his hands restrained, and recounted the events of that Friday night in 1989 with chilling, unfeeling clarity, without a trace of remorse. He spoke of the argument, of JJ's defiance, of the intense anger that consumed him, like some dark entity. He admitted to striking the boy, intending to discipline him, but causing him to fall. In that moment, a new, more disturbing idea was born, an idea that would lead to unimaginable distress. "He shouldn't have challenged me," Frank said, his voice even, devoid of emotion, as if he were speaking of something mundane. Not in my own house. I decided then and there to fix the problem, so he would understand what real control was. He then proudly described, like a craftsman, how he spent the rest of that weekend building the false wall, meticulously planning every detail. He explained how he confined his stepson, sealed him in, and then went upstairs to comfort his grieving wife, playing the role of a loving husband. His actions, a perfect, silent secret, buried just a yard from where she slept, unaware of the situation unfolding under her roof. When Detective Pierce asked him about the false runaway note, a small, cruel smirk appeared on Frank's lips, expressing his cynicism and contempt. "It was easy," he said. "I found one of his old-school notebooks in the trash. Practiced his signature for about 10 minutes until it was good enough. The words? I just wrote what you people always want to believe." His confession was shocking, revealing the full depth of his calculating and ruthless nature. When Pierce relayed the details of the confession to Vanessa, her grief was compounded by a new, horrifying layer of betrayal. The man with whom she shared her life, the man she trusted, was an individual of unimaginable cruelty, hiding behind a facade of respectability. Her quiet inner fears, which she had dismissed as the paranoia of a grieving mother, were a pale shadow of the terrifying reality. She had lived with her son's captor, and this realization was unbearable. The revelation about Frank Davis sent shockwaves through their community, like an earthquake shattering the illusion of calm. The quiet carpenter, the concerned stepfather, turned out to be a cold, calculating individual whose actions deeply disturbed everyone. The 1989 police department was publicly disgraced for a biased, superficial investigation that allowed this situation to continue for 6 long years, leaving a child confined. This story was a stark testament to a system that failed a black child and his mother at every turn. A failure that was rectified only by the accidental, chaotic intervention of a burst pipe during a storm, as if fate itself intervened to reveal the truth. Frank Davis's trial was a swift, somber affair, leaving no room for doubt. Faced with his own detailed, unsparing confession and the irrefutable physical evidence of the hidden chamber and his living, traumatized victim, his defense could do little. He was found responsible for confinement and a range of related charges, and sentenced to a lengthy period of incarceration without the possibility of early release. Justice, in the cold, efficient language of the law, had been served, but for Vanessa, it was only the beginning of a new path. But for Vanessa Marshall, the court's verdict was not an end, but the beginning of another, more difficult journey, a path of recovery and healing. The individual responsible was confined, but she had to navigate the ruins of a life built on a foundation of monstrous deception. The man she loved, the man she shared her bed with, the man she allowed to comfort her in her grief, was the very source of that grief. The betrayal was so profound, so absolute, that it altered her understanding of her own past, tainting every memory of the past 6 years with a horrifying, grotesque new meaning. She immediately sold the house on Maple Drive. She could not bear another night within its walls, knowing what they had concealed, what they had witnessed. She moved to a new city, seeking anonymity in a place where she was not the woman who had lived with her son's captor, where she would not be haunted by the past. The story of J.J. Marshall and his stepfather became a national sensation, a cautionary tale of domestic distress, a symbol of the secrets that can fester behind the closed doors of a seemingly normal suburban home. For a time, Vanessa was besieged by reporters, television producers, people who wanted to turn her pain into a true crime special, a spectacle for the public. She refused them all. Her story was not entertainment. It was a childhood lived and lost, which she was not going to sell. The subsequent years were a quiet, difficult process of rebuilding, a slow but persistent return to life. Vanessa focused entirely on JJ's recovery, a path that at times seemed impossible, full of obstacles and despair. JJ, now a 19-year-old young man, had to relearn the world like a newborn, but with traumas that bore the imprint of 6 years of confinement. He feared open spaces, loud sounds, other people. His mind was a fractured landscape of fear and confusion. He had spent his entire adolescence in a dark room, and the world of 1995 was an overwhelming, incomprehensible assault on his senses that he had to learn to endure. Vanessa became his fierce, unwavering advocate, his guide back into a world that was alien and frightening to him. She sat with him through many years of intensive therapy, patiently helping him overcome each barrier. She patiently taught him things a mother should never have to teach her grown son: how to order food in a restaurant, how to use a phone, how to simply walk down the street without being consumed by panic. It was a long and arduous process, but she was there every step of the way. The brilliant, energetic boy who loved hip-hop and art had disappeared, replaced by a quiet, frightened man who was a stranger to his own life, as if his soul had been exchanged. The past left an indelible mark on him, changing him beyond recognition. The story concludes many years later. Vanessa is now a grandmother, her hair grayed, but a new, calm light has appeared in her eyes. She has a new family, a new life, but the scar on her soul remains forever, a reminder of what she endured. She is in the backyard of her small, sunny home, a place filled with light and laughter, where peace and tranquility reign. She watches her grandchildren play, their joyful cries sharply contrasting with the long silence that once defined her life. She is not healed in the simple way that stories often promise. Her pain has not completely vanished, but she has learned to live with it. The memory of JJ, her bright, energetic boy, is always with her, and watching her grandchildren, she feels not only the impact of his absence, but also the enduring strength of his memory. She survived. Her family survived. And in this survival, there's a quiet, powerful victory, a testament to human resilience. She learned that the most important barriers are not those made of plaster and wood, but those we build around our hearts, protecting them from pain and disappointment. And that the bravest act of all is not just breaking down the barriers that confine us, but finding the strength to build new ones, those that let in light, hope, and love. The difficulties of her past are part of her story, but they are not her end. The conclusion is this: a quiet afternoon, a sunny backyard, the laughter of children, and a peace that is not perfect, but, against all odds, real and well-deserved.